We're up and recording. You can start anytime.
Thank you for your interest in the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan. This is an introduction to the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan as part of the public comment process for the Conowingo WIP development. Thank you again for joining us. Just as a quick introduction, I'm joined today by my colleague Deb with the Center for Watershed Protection, who's going to talk a little bit about the modeling and how we developed some of the load calculations for the Conowingo WIP. And we have our partner Carly Dean with the Chesapeake Conservancy, who is going to talk about how we developed some of the Conowingo WIP. My name is Brian Sipe. I'm a senior project manager for the Center for Watershed Protection and the lead for the Conowingo WIP development on the grantee side. And I'll be walking you through how we got to developing the WIP and how we're going to move forward with implementation as we try to achieve the goals set forward in the WIP. So an outline for today's webcast, as I mentioned before, we're going to start out just talking a little bit about why we need the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan, what the framework is behind that Watershed Implementation Plan, how it is we're going to work together to achieve these goals, what are the roles and responsibilities of the entities involved in this process, what our estimated timeline is, and the draft overview of the WIP itself. So first up, the need for the Conowingo WIP is because we really have a tremendous amount of additional load to deal with. And essentially that's coming from the 27,500 square mile Susquehanna River Basin, which all drains to the Conowingo Reservoir and the Conowingo Dam. The Conowingo Dam and its reservoir were built in 1928 and are currently owned and operated by Exelon Corporation as a hydroelectric dam. The Conowingo Dam and the other dams in the lower Susquehanna, those other dams are the York Haven, Safe Harbor, and the Holtwood, which are all shown on this map here, have historically trapped and stored sediment and pollutants from reaching the Chesapeake Bay. They were essentially acting as a BMP themselves. However, in 2015, a study by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Maryland Department of Environment concluded that the reservoir had reached dynamic equilibrium and that it was no longer trapping sediment and associated nutrients. A dynamic equilibrium essentially means that as load builds up behind the dam, large storms come through and will blow whatever that accumulated material is out and create a little bit of space, and then additional load will fill in, but that'll eventually blow out again. So essentially over the long term, the dam is no longer trapping sediment and nutrients over that longer period of time. So as a result, when the Chesapeake Bay program partnership started to develop their watershed plans, their phase 3 watershed plans, there was a gap of about 6 million pounds of nitrogen, about 0.26 million pounds of phosphorus that was not accounted for because the original assumption was the dams were providing some attenuation of sediment and nutrients. And now that's not happening anymore, so there's this gap. And we need to mitigate the water quality impacts of that Conowingo reservoir infill in the form of this additional 6 million pounds of nitrogen and 0.26 million pounds of phosphorus. So in December of 2017, the Chesapeake Bay Partnership agreed to develop a separate Conowingo planning target and to collectively develop a separate Conowingo WIP. And all of the the Principal Staff Committee, or the PSC, jurisdictional members agreed to pool their resources and to identify a process to fund and implement the Conowingo WIP. So it's an additional load that the Bay jurisdictions agreed to work on collaboratively to try to address. But this also provides a unique opportunity for us all to build on existing and successful programs that are already being used to achieve the Chesapeake Bay goals, and to as much as possible, as much as feasible, avoid creating duplicative bureaucracies, and maybe even find some opportunities for creative financing and innovative BMPs. So the framework is really an agreement amongst all of the jurisdictions that recognizes these three core attributes. One is that the trapping of pollutants by the Conowingo Reservoir over the 80+ years has benefited all of the Bay jurisdictions by lessening the load reduction responsibilities so far. However, as we've just discussed, those benefits have now been greatly diminished by that Conowingo infill. So now the load that the dam was holding back is now coming through, and that benefit is no longer there. There hasn't been any maintenance to restore the trapping capacity behind that dam over the life of the dam, and so it's now full. So there's no capacity left. We haven't dredged or done anything else, so we now have this additional load. And the most cost-effective approach to mitigate the water quality impacts of the Conowingo Reservoir infill are really realized by pooling all of our resources to pay for pollutant reduction practices in the most effective location. So instead of just scattershotting wherever, this WIP really looks at positioning BMPs in the most effective locations. In other words, where the load is being generated, and try to position the best BMPs in those locations so we can achieve the maximum amount of benefit at the lowest cost. So there's a variety of entities involved in this process. Leading up is the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, who's evaluating the CWIP. They provide biennial evaluations of the progress towards attaining our CWIP goals and work with the PSC to determine if adjustments are necessary as we advance. They have issued a request for applications for third-party grantees. That is us here at the center and with Carly at the Chesapeake Conservancy to administer, and they administer those cooperative agreements. They also provide technical staff and additional contractor support for this effort. There's a CWIP steering committee, which consists of representatives from each of the Bay jurisdictions. So Delaware, the District of Columbia, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. It also includes the Chesapeake Bay Commission. The CWIP steering committee is there to solicit comments from stakeholders to develop the CWIP with EPA staff and grantee support, again, that's us, and to guide the development of a CWIP financing strategy and the implementation of that strategy, which is currently ongoing. And then there is the PSC, or the Principal Staff Committee. They are there to approve the final draft ultimately for submittal to the Chesapeake Bay Partnership. They provide comment on the draft and on the final. They review the progress of the steering committee in the development of the implementation of the CWIP. So essentially the way that this is set up is the steering committee works collectively on developing the strategies, and the Principal Staff Committee reviews and approves those for advancement. So additional roles and responsibility, the CWIP is divided into three activities, three EPA funded activities, or third-party grantees as described earlier. So the first activity, which is what we're really talking about today, which is to facilitate the development and the implementation of the Conowingo WIP and the associated 2-year milestones. This process is being led by this group here. So the Center for Watershed Protection, with support from the Chesapeake Conservancy, University of Maryland Sea Grant Extension, and the Harry R. Hughes Center for Agroecology. Together, our goal is to provide overall assistance to the CWIP Steering Committee to develop the plan, to develop the 2-year milestones for the CWIP, to target effective practices to reduce pollutant loadings, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a few slides, and establish a timeline for achieving the CWIP, And then finally, which we're starting today, conducting watershed-wide stakeholder outreach. So that's our activity. We also have others that are working on, or EPA also has others working on other activities associated. This is activity 2, develop and propose a comprehensive CWIP financing strategy and an associated implementation plan. This process is ongoing now. The lead grantee is the Chesapeake Bay Trust. The work is primarily being carried out by the Center for Global Sustainability and the School for Public Policy at University of Maryland and Fro Environmental. Their goal is to develop, propose, and implement the Conowingo financing strategy, the identification of necessary financing approaches, the assessment of legal authorities, restrictions, and processes necessary to propose a multi-jurisdiction and multi-sector finance and investment system, and to link the economic development to restoration finance. So that process is ongoing currently. And then thirdly, there's the third activity, tracking, verifying, and reporting implementation of CWIP and two-year milestones. This is being led by the Chesapeake Conservancy with support from the Commons and the Center for Watershed Protection. This is really building on work that these partners are already doing to streamline and consolidate the tracking and verification of practices as they go into the ground. So this moves us into the draft overview, and Carly's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Brian. For the CWIP draft overview, it's important to keep in mind that the CWIP Steering Committee considered a variety of different scenarios and geographies in their decision making. Cost effectiveness is a major factor in the selection of the primary CWIP strategy presented today. The primary CWIP geography had full consensus of the steering committee, which includes all of the jurisdictions and the Chesapeake Bay Commission. Please note that the BMPs include both agricultural and urban practices. The modeling helps us understand the level of implementation needed to achieve the nitrogen reduction goals outlined in the CWIP. And the draft describes contingencies if implementation of the primary CWIP strategy is not sufficiently meeting the goals within the stated timeline. To develop a cost-effective CWIP scenario, the primary goal was to minimize the cost per pound of nitrogen reduction using Chesapeake Bay Assessment Scenario Tool cost profiles. Past cost profiles include cost estimates per unit of BMP implemented for each state. Additional information can be found in the CAST documentation. The primary geography for the primary CWIP strategy includes the most nitrogen effective land river segments within the Susquehanna River Basin. A land river segment is a planning unit that's around the size of a Huck 12 watershed based on river segments that are intersected with jurisdictional boundaries or land segments. The Chesapeake Bay program uses land river segments to support modeling and watershed implementation plan efforts. The BMPs include both agricultural and urban practices, and the states where implementation will occur are Maryland, Pennsylvania, and New York. At the implementation level presented in the draft CWIP, the nitrogen reductions will exceed the 6 million pound target at 6.7 million pounds per year. And the total annualized cost for implementation in this strategy is $53.3 million per year, which comes out to about $8 per pound of nitrogen produced. To address efficiency and cost effectiveness, BMP implementation is targeted to the places that are most effective at delivering nitrogen to the Chesapeake Bay and therefore offer the best opportunity to improve conditions in the bay by reducing nitrogen loads. More specifically, implementation is targeted to areas where reducing nitrogen locally will have the greatest impact on increasing dissolved oxygen in the bay. This map illustrates nitrogen effectiveness across the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed. Darker land river segments are more effective. The primary CWIP geography includes the top half, most nitrogen effective land river segments within the Susquehanna River Basin. Again, this geography had full consensus of the CWIP Steering Committee and is what is used for planning and targeting implementation in the draft CWIP. Here's a list of the counties included. Note that several counties are only marginally within the primary CWIP geography. So now that we've described the primary CWIP geography, Deb will talk about the primary CWIP BMPs.
Thanks, Carly. So I'm going to walk you through kind of how we selected both the types of BMPs that we were planning on using and the level of implementation. When we selected which BMPs we were going to focus on, our primary considerations were how effective they are at reducing nitrogen, so what's their efficiency. Are they applicable in the Susquehanna River Basin? By applicable, we mean, are they a practice that is appropriate to the climate and the soils? And also part of that applicability was, is it a practice that does not take much agricultural land out of production? So we thought about that as kind of an overriding issue. And finally, we looked at the cost effectiveness on a per unit basis so that we can select the most cost effective practices. And finally, we were looking to have a mix of both urban and agricultural practices to achieve the goals. Thank you. So walking through the modeling process in a little bit more detail, we used the Chesapeake Bay CAST model or the CAST tool to do the modeling effort. The baseline for both the level of BMP implementation and for the loadings was the plans that were submitted by the states for their phase 3 WIPs. So that's kind of our starting point. We did this modeling in kind of a 4-step process. The first 2 steps I'm going to talk about right here were about selecting the level of implementation for our agricultural BMPs. So this is kind of the lion's share of the work is by the agricultural BMPs. And so we first started with them. As an initial target, based on the candidate BMPs we selected, we chose an approximate level of implementation, kind of a target level of implementation that we derived by looking at the WIP 3 plans. We kind of zoomed in on the WIP 3 plans from each state, and we tried to see what was about the maximum level within any land river segment that we could see in the plan. So for example, for nutrient management, core nitrogen, we focused it on this, on all agricultural land that did not include open space. And we kind of looked across the states to see, what was kind of a high level of implementation that we saw. And then, using that, we selected a target level of implementation. So, for nutrient management, using that example, we chose 90% of all agricultural land, excluding open space, as our potential target area. After we had selected those levels, we ran the CAST model and adjusted those levels so that we could achieve our nitrogen goals using only agricultural BMPs. Could someone advance it, please? It's not controlling for me. Thanks. Our next 2 steps were steps 3 and 4 were about adding urban BMPs to that model. So we already had a model that was achieving our targets using agricultural BMPs only. And then in addition to that, we focused on areas that were not regulated by the MPDES program. And we looked at using urban forest planting and urban forest buffers, both because these practices were cost effective, but also because they help to achieve other goals, other Bay-wide goals of increasing forest cover and increasing urban forest buffers. So similar process, we selected a level of implementation, in this case on non-regulated turf, and we ran the model again. The last step of our modeling process was to kind of ratchet back our agricultural BMPs so that we weren't overshooting by too much after we had then added these urban BMPs. The result was that we adjusted our agricultural BMP implementation down to just about 95% of what our ag-only model was. This slide shows the resulting levels of implementation, and also kind of could show you a full suite of the BMPs that were implemented. You can see we're using kind of a combination on our agricultural BMPs. We have really kind of heavy implementation of these management practices, like, you know, urban nutrient, agricultural nitrogen management and conservation tillage. Those practices, again, do not take agricultural land out of production and are very cost effective. But we also kind of rounded it out with some other practices like forest buffers and wetland restoration that are also cost effective. And in addition, you know, help to meet some other goals of, again, increasing forest cover and wetland area. And finally, these same two urban practices. The resulting load reductions, you can kind of see a summary of, you know, what major sector those loads were taken from and what states they occurred in detail. Overall, this plan or the strategy would would hit our nitrogen target by exceed it by 700,000 pounds. However, we did not hit that phosphorus target of 0.26 million. So there may need to be some trading between nitrogen and phosphorus. The great majority of the load reduction is coming from Pennsylvania. That's not much of a surprise given that the geography is primarily in Pennsylvania. And finally, most of the load, almost 90% of the load reduction, comes from the agricultural sector. Again, not a surprise given you know, the amount of agricultural practices that were implemented. Okay, so that's, oh, sorry.
Thank you, Deb. Appreciate that. So now that we've identified the areas in which we are going to target practices and which practices we're going to target, next thing we'll just discuss is our proposed implementation approach. So we have three primary mechanisms which we envision implementation of the Conowingo WIP occurring. First option is utilizing existing state cost share programs. There are a host of existing programs available that are currently in use in the various states. And the Conowingo WIP could utilize those existing state cost share programs by providing additional human resources, financial resources, etc., to take on the additional work required that's been identified in this plan. Another option would be to use existing organizations with financing capacity to drive implementation. So this would be individual organizations like a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation that can provide funding or financing at scale across multiple states to implement the practices identified here. And then finally, performance-based contracting. or an approach that really leverages the efforts of the private sector and provides funding to those projects that offer the best value or the lowest cost with the highest load reduction. So in other words, the funding would be awarded to those projects that demonstrate they can achieve a high level of efficiency in terms of cost per pound reduced. So a couple of ways to potentially implement the Conowingo WIP. All of these will be influenced by the financing strategy, which is in progress currently. So when we talk about this CWIP and the implementation of it, there is this is an extra load that we're dealing with here. So it is going to be a challenge, and so we have to think about some contingencies and some contingency plans to provide safeguards to ensure that the nitrogen loads are reductions are achieved. And if not, what are we going to do to meet those goals in the timeline we've provided? So the contingencies that we've identified in the CWIP, the first one is to reevaluate priority watersheds. Carly went through the existing priority watershed, which focuses primarily on the Susquehanna River Basin. This could be expanded to include more watersheds within that area or additional watersheds outside of the Susquehanna River Basin and in other states. So essentially looking to expand the area in which we work. The second is to expand the list of BMPs. We've identified an initial list of BMPs that are both cost effective and, as Deb mentioned earlier, do not necessarily remove agricultural land from production. We could expand that list or look at additional BMPs if some of those on the list are not achievable at those levels or not feasible. Another option would be dredging, which we'll talk about a little bit more shortly, but there is some ongoing studies and work looking at whether dredging behind the Conowingo Dam would be feasible and possible to reduce loads. That work is ongoing, and there should be some more information in the future, but a contingency could involve dredging depending on the results of that study. And then finally, there's reassigning loads. As we described in the framework, there was a decision by the PSC and others to collectively address the Conowingo WIP as a separate standalone watershed implementation plan. However, if we fail to achieve the necessary reductions, EPA can elect to then reassign the loads, the 6 million pounds, to the jurisdictions, and they would need to address those additional loads in their planning as they move ahead. So EPA can just reassign the loads to the jurisdictions based on their calculations. But we do think that the contingency planning does offer quite a bit of flexibility to consider alternative approaches as we continue through the implementation process. Importantly, it could provide the opportunity to foster innovations in the financing system, so ways to reduce transaction costs, etc. There may be, as we progress, some ways to look at the financing of annual practices versus structural practices, etc., and how that impacts overall costs to develop a more flexible plan, alternative approach as we move forward. Similarly, looking forward at potential alternative and innovative BMPs or technologies as a way to achieve nitrogen goals at a reduced cost. So BMPs that are currently under development or technologies that are currently in process that in the future may be available to us to achieve our Conowingo WIP nitrogen goals. An example of this is in Maryland, where, as I just described earlier, Maryland is working with the Chesapeake Bay Partnership to evaluate environmental dredging behind the Conowingo Dam as a solution, as a potential solution to the load reduction requirement. The Conowingo WIP Steering Committee has already recommended forming an expert panel to explore this and other innovative ways to achieve the Conowingo WIP goals. And as that information becomes more available, as that data becomes available, these other approaches, these other technologies may be an approach that we can take with the Conowingo WIP implementation as well. Certainly a plan like this offers significant challenges as well as opportunities. The first is refining the cost estimates to get a better understanding, particularly of the technical assistance costs to achieve the implementation goals. We understand that this standalone Conowingo WIP is in addition to and separate from the state WIP 3, so the state phase 3 WIPs. So because there's additional work occurring, additional assistance is going to be needed, additional tech resources for the agricultural community and others will be needed. So we need to get a better understanding of the costs for that assistance and the backup to support the implementation of these practices. So further understanding the costs of implementing these practices. Further consideration of the feasibility and the costs and reductions associated with annual versus structural practices. As we showed earlier, there is a variety of BMPs utilized in the Conowingo WIP. Some of those BMPs are annual practices that would need to be implemented each year to be effective. Some of those are structural that last some number of years, generally many years to several decades. So those annual practices tend to be cheaper up front, but again, they have to be done, repeated every year to maintain the reduction, versus a structural practice, which generally has a higher cost up front, but provides functionality for a much longer period of time. The financing and the costs associated with those practices over the long term may impact the overall cost effectiveness of any one practice. Certainly a big opportunity here is to engage the public to ground truth the model primary implementation strategy and geography for feasibility. Deb just went through the modeling process that we took on to determine the amount of BMPs implemented and the loads associated with that implementation. There is a lot of implementation occurring as part of the Conowingo WIP, and the feasibility of doing that in the same areas as the Chesapeake Bay implementation are certainly significant. We need to better understand how the existing phase 3 WIPs impact the feasibility of this Conowingo WIP. And then finally, to consider and resolve the tracking, accounting, and crediting issues as they relate to jurisdictional WIPs. Again, because this is a standalone Conowingo WIP, any BMPs that are implemented as part of this, as part of the achievement of the goals here, need to be tracked and accounted for separately from the phase 3 jurisdictional WIPs. We can't double count practices that count towards the Conowingo WIP, or at least the credits for those practices cannot be also counted for towards the Chesapeake Bay phase 3 WIP. So we need to be able to track, account, and credit those practices accordingly. So moving forward, our estimated Conowingo WIP timeline. Right now we're in phase 1, which is the draft Conowingo WIP. We start the 60-day public comment period on October 14th, and that public comment period will close on December 21st. Starting in early 2021, based on the comments we receive, we will begin to revise the Conowingo draft, which will be presented to the PSC and the CWIP steering committee, who will continue to review and ultimately approve a final CWIP. We anticipate milestone planning to begin for 2021 and 2022. So we'll start the planning of those milestones in 2021, and then implementation is expected to begin in 2022 through 2025. Although the timeline for full implementation of the Conowingo WIP has not been fully determined yet, it is anticipated that we will at least be implementing practices from 2022 through 2025 and possibly beyond. That timeline will be determined as part of the final CWIP document. So the public comment period, which is hopefully why you listen to this webcast today, is what we're hoping to get from you. So how to provide public comment. The first thing to do is to access the Conowingo WIP document on the Chesapeake Bay Program website. The web address is provided here. Once you've reviewed the document and you have comments, please send us an email to cwip@chesapeakebay.net with the subject line CWIP public comment. Please provide your comment there. We will compile all of those comments and provide those to the PSC and the steering committee for review. Those comments will be considered and addressed as part of the development of the final CWIP draft. You can also contact us with questions, and this is important. You'll also send the emails to cwip@chesapeakebay.net, but in the subject line, please write CWIP questions. We will do our best to respond to you with the answer to your questions. We cannot guarantee you we have an answer, but we will try to answer your questions if we can. This is important though. Emails with the subject CWIP questions will not be documented formally as public comment. If you want to provide a formal comment, you need to provide us an email that has the subject line CWIP public comment. We'll certainly track your questions, but it will not be listed as a comment. So please send us emails with the subject line CWIP public comment if your email is intended to serve as your comment. Again, the website is here. You can find the draft as well as some additional resources at that location. So moving forward, again, key dates to keep in mind. October 14th starts the 60-day public comment period. Please, we really do, as we said before, need and want your comments and your feedback. It's critical for us to understanding the challenges and opportunities that we are facing with the Conowingo WIP implementation. So please send us your comments before December 21st, which will be when that draft CWIP public comment period closes. Again, cwip@chesapeakebay.net is the email address there. We provided the speaker contact information here for my colleague Deb, as well as Carly. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. But again, please utilize that cwip@chesapeakebay.net for your formal public comments. Again, I want to thank Deb and Carly for their assistance today on the webcast. I want to thank the Chesapeake Bay Program Partnership, the EPA, the steering committee, and the PSC for their diligent efforts in getting the draft WIP to this point. We look forward to reviewing your public comments, and thank you for your time.